This demonstration is to show how to put in a continuous lap placket. So plackets in garments are used to allow us space and extra fabric stability in order to apply closures. So by closures, I mean hardware like buttons, snaps, things like that. Closures that require a zipper do not need a placket, but other closures do. So this is important to note. We often are putting plackets in the back of skirts that do not have zippers in them. So if we're doing period skirts, rehearsal skirts, we're often adding a placket to put snaps on and then fastening the waistband with a skirt hook and bar. And waistbands go on in a similar fashion, so I'll chat about that a little bit as well. You might find plackets in the sleeve of a dress shirt or some other garment that requires a button or snap in order to get that sleeve to fit tighter to your wrist. You may find plackets running down the center of button-up shirts, as we like to call them. So dress shirts and things like that have a special piece, a button placket applied. So this is a continuous lap placket, is a little bit different than that center front button placket. But a continuous lap placket means that I'm going to use one piece of fabric to go up and down both sides of the opening in, say, a skirt. So this piece right here, I've cut myself a sample piece. This is representing the skirt pieces or the center back or side of my skirt that I'm putting this placket in. And what I would do is first measure the opening. So how far open do I need this garment to be to get it down off of someone's hips? And generally for many people, that's around 7 or 8 inches. Sometimes we leave a little bit more so that people have the ease of taking that garment off, especially if we're putting in a zipper. But I've already pre-marked my fabric to 8 inches so that I have an 8-inch opening in the back of the skirt. If I'm later to put a waistband on the top of it, I would lose 1/2 inch in my waistband seam allowance, so my opening would technically be 7.5 inches. But you need to know that amount beforehand, before you start sewing. Also, you need that amount to be able to cut your placket piece, which I will get to in just a moment. So if this is representing the center back of my skirt, I have marked the opening and I'm going to sew the opening to the hem of the skirt. So I'm going to sew all the other parts of the center back seam, but leave this opening in it. That opening is obviously essential to getting it onto the body. So I'm going to pin from the end of my hem, in quotation marks, because this would be a very short skirt, but that's okay, to that mark where my placket is going to end. So I've marked that with a fabric marker right there. And I'm only going to sew this bottom portion of the seam shut before I begin applying my placket. I will turn the machine on and sew this seam as I traditionally would. It is right side to right side. I'm going to make sure that when I sew, I go up to, but not past my mark. And I've sewn that at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you can see that stitching here that I've stitched from my mark to my hem. And then I will get ready to apply my placket piece, which is its own separate piece from the skirt panels. Before I apply my placket, I'm going to open up this seam with my iron, get it to lay smooth and flat. Now I'm ready to apply my placket piece. So let's talk a little bit about what the placket is and how big it is. So the goal of the placket is to give me a piece that runs down the opening, both sides of the opening. It also finishes the edge of the seam, and it is multi-layered. So often in plackets, we're going to put a piece of interfacing behind this placket, so it's not only double layered on itself when it's finished, but it's also got that piece of interfacing in there so that it's got some stability. And then we can sew our buttons or our snaps through all of these layers, and we have a great amount of stability when we're using those closures. So I'm going to cut a piece that is the entire length of my opening. So if my original opening was 8 inches, which included the seam allowance of the piece all the way to the top, I would cut this rectangle, this piece of the placket, 16 inches long, right? Because it needs to go from one end to the other all the way through. Also, I would apply this placket and make sure the placket is finished in there before I apply a waistband to the top of the skirt. So this is a step that needs to happen before that is added. Then I determine the width of my placket by how large I want this placket to be when it is finished, when it's double layered. So I am shooting for an inch wide placket that would allow me to put some medium size snaps on here. An inch wide placket, double layered on itself with seam allowance built in. So I cut my placket to 3 inches. 1 inch on the double equals 2, plus a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side. Then I'm going to start pinning it into place. So I will put the placket on top of my skirt piece. You can see my center back skirt seam is open at the top. I'm going to lay it from end to end onto this. And then I want to make sure I actually pin this from the skirt side. And I will show you exactly why I'm doing that in a second. But I will start pinning at the ends and work my way towards the center like I like to do. But I really want to pin it and also sew it from the skirt side. So looking at the skirt side so that I can see where that seam happens. If I'm doing it from the placket side, I can't really see that seam, and I want to make sure that I don't accidentally run over things I'm not meaning to. So I'm going to pin all the way to where this previous stitching is. So that is the stitching in the center back seam where I had already marked my placket to stop. I'm going to flip the skirt out of the way, and I'm going to pin the other side in the same way. And if you have measured and cut this accurately, it should fit just perfectly. If you find yourself with too much or too little, you have made a mistake either in your measuring, cutting, or stitching. So you need to double check that you've measured the opening accurately, you've measured your placket accurately, and that you've sewn from the accurate mark. Okay, now we'll be sewing the placket into place. And we'll do this in 2 steps. I will sew from one side and meet the stitching in my skirt. I want to get right up to this original stitching, not leaving a gap, but also not sewing into the skirt itself. So it's going to be a little bit tricky to get right up and just meet that stitching. I will do the same thing on the other end, but you do have to sew them separately because you don't want to run over your skirt piece. So I'm sewing this all at the same seam allowance. That's also important that your skirt seam allowance and that your placket seam allowance match each other. So I sewed my skirt seam allowance at 1/2 inch. I will also sew my placket at 1/2 inch. And as I approach my previous stitching, I do want to make sure I slow down and don't go crazy. Even use the hand wheel to get all the way up there and just barely meet that stitching, and then go backwards. So you do back stitch at this. Then I will flip that skirt. So this is the skirt section. This is the first part of the placket. Flip the skirt out of the way and sew the rest of it. So again, just meeting my original stitching. I can do that by adjusting where I sink that needle into the fabric. Right here, I'm gonna stitch, back stitch, and again, be careful not to back stitch into the placket. Okay, now you'll need to break your iron back out. I think my iron killed my other light. Well, we'll make do. But you want to get your iron back out because you want to iron all these pieces open appropriately. You also want to have your scissors handy because you will need to clip, meaning that I need to clip the seam allowance of the skirt as it sits right below the placket. So I'm just clipping my threads real quick, but I'm clipping so this is the skirt portion. The placket is here attached to the skirt. And I'm going to clip the skirt seam allowance right underneath the placket, right there. This is important to allow the placket to lay flat as you're trying to press it. Again, it's really important that your stitching met and got really close here. If you've got a gap at this point, you're going to have a hole at the bottom of the placket. So keep your eyes on that as well. So I'm ironing the placket and the skirt open. And then ironing also the opposite side in the same way. If I can get this open with one hand. Okay, so I've ironed all of that open. Now this is what it looks like. We're still in progress, but making better progress. This is my skirt. These are my skirt panels. And this whole piece that sits in a V is my placket piece. I'm not yet done with it, however. We're going to turn it and sew it again so that it is that double layer that I talked about. Eventually it'll be about this wide and it will fold over. So like one side of it will fold on top of the other side, allowing snaps or buttons to lay there. The preparation and stitching of this is very similar to how you put on a waistband. So if you're curious about how to put on a waistband of a skirt or a pant, it's very, very similar. So typically waistbands are double as wide as they end up being when they are sewn. They've got that seam allowance built in there. Usually they're also interfaced. They've got usually a sew-on or iron-on interfacing on the back side, so they've got that extra thickness and stability. And we sew them on in much the same manner. So they would be sewn around the top or the pant of the skirt, and then they will be flipped over and sewn again. And this method of completing your placket and also sewing on your waistband is called stitch in the ditch, which is one of my favorite sewing terms. It's really hilarious, and it is referring to the fact that you could theoretically flip this over. You could neatly hand stitch this to your seam allowance here, and from the front side, no one would ever see any of that stitching, and it would be lovely and perfect. But who has time for that? I don't. So this is a great way that you can do all of this by machine. And to stitch in the ditch means that we are going to prep and pin this placket edge, or sometimes waistband edge, with our seam allowance inside of it. We'll actually flip the edge in, which I'll show you in a second, and then we are going to stitch it from the front side in the ditch or in the existing seam. And if your fabric and thread color match, and you do this very accurately, you have sort of a crease or a divot to put that stitch down into. So the thicker and loftier your fabric is, the more ditch or depth that you have, and usually the stitch in the ditch kind of disappears in front of your eyes and you can't really see it from the outside. If you have thin and flat fabrics, that stitch might be a little bit more obvious, but again, if you've already created this shadow of a seam, then putting a little top stitch in there is not distracting, and you will rarely notice it as you're looking at the front of the garment. So it's a really great, efficient way to finish these things. How I prepped my stitch in the ditch is to first roll the edge of my seam allowance of my placket, or could be waistband, in, and I'm going to roll it in 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. I want to make sure that I've got some space there, that when I fold and stitch, that I'm going to be able to grab both edges of the fabric. And I'm going to iron this as I fold it to prep this edge. Again, this is to prevent raw edges from hanging out, because no one wants that. Occasionally I've seen people construct garments where they serge this edge and then they just simply flip it over and leave the serged edge exposed. I like it better folded. It does take one step extra, but it does look very nice and neat once it's done. So I folded my seam allowance edge in. Then I'm going to go back with the iron, and I'm going to push all my placket and skirt seam allowances into the placket so that they will eventually be encased and we will never see those again. Get the skirt piece out of the way. And again, I'm just pushing those seam allowances inside of the placket so they will go away once we're ready to stitch. Then be ready to pin well, and be patient with your pinning as you do. But you're going to pin the fold or the edge of the seam allowance that you rolled under on the placket just past your stitch line. It wants to cover the stitch line, but it doesn't want to go too far over. If it goes too far over, then the fold I created there won't be caught by the sewing machine. All the layers won't be caught. So I want to make sure that it just barely covers that seam edge. And I am pinning perpendicular to the line that I will be sewing. I'm pinning from the inside of the garment. I will be sewing from the outside. So you will be running over these pins as you go. Make sure that the head of the pin is not too close to this folded edge. Otherwise you might hit the head of the pin. That would be bad. I'm going to go to the opposite side and pin that and then work my way towards center, as I often advise you to do. Again, I'm just double checking myself that I'm going just past that edge. You can kind of feel it with your fingers too. You can feel the seam underneath and where you're placing that edge. It takes a little bit of practice to be able to get it just in the right spot. Okay, in the center, you want to make sure that, again, this is why we clipped our seam allowance, that we get it to stay out of our way. It's raining pins. Maybe one more pin to just finish it off. All right, now I'm prepped and I'm ready to sew. You can see this edge, the folded edge, is just past where that seam sits. And now it's time to stitch on the outside. So now is the actual stitch in the ditch. So I'll turn on my machine. Sorry, it's a little shady under there. My other light is still, oh, there it goes. It just needed time to rest. I think it got too hot and then it went out again. Amazing. All right, so my goal is to put the needle right down the existing seam and to follow this existing seam as best I can. So stitch and back stitch, go forward. Again, you're running over the pins you put in, so make sure you're careful about doing that. And you want to make sure you're not stitching up on the placket itself, but right down that seam. Okay, and a back stitch at the end. So theoretically, if I did this right, it should be sitting in the seam and it should have caught all my edges. Now is the moment of truth. We want to make sure, go to the back side and be absolutely sure that it has caught this folded edge. If it slips off the folded edge, you're going to have a hole in this little placket. So you want to make sure you go back and repair that. It looks like we've hit the edge. Yay. Success. The very last step is to go back to it with an iron. And this is when we decide what folds over what. So one of our placket edges will be the overlay piece of the placket and one will sit underneath. So where we have the placket that overlays, we will fold it backwards like this. And the other one will stay flat. So I'm going to iron the one that will be the overlay. And then it will lay on top of the other placket piece. And then we can kind of iron it again to make sure everything lays nice and smoothly down that placket. Okay, so now we have a completed placket, and you can see here that is a little hidden piece that will allow us to apply our buttons, our snaps, and then once the skirt is closed, you won't see that placket at all, but it will sit underneath the layers. Then if this were a complete skirt, we'd apply our waistband pieces on top of this edge, and they would go on much like this placket edge did, and they would finish out the entire garment.